Chapter 5. The Break-In, the Bullet, and the Kiss. Carlos was staring at the clock, 11:47 p.m. He couldn't sleep. The lingering shame from Gary's messages and Ricardo's possessive promise had wound him up too tight. He was sitting on the sofa, the curtains drawn, a mug of tea cold in his hands. He kept hearing the faint echo of Ricardo's voice, "No one hurts what's mine." It should have been comforting, but it was a declaration of war. Carlos knew Ricardo wouldn't just send a cease and desist letter. A noise. It wasn't a subtle noise. It was the distinct sound of forced entry, the sickening crack of splintering wood coming from the back door. Carlos shot up, dropping the mug. It shattered silently on the rug. Gary. He knew it instinctively. Cornered by debt, desperate for revenge, Gary had brought the real thugs to the suburbs. Carlos scrambled into the kitchen, his heart slamming against his ribs. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking too violently to dial. He could hear voices now, muffled shouts, heavy breathing, and the sound of the door frame being slowly torn apart. He ducked behind the kitchen counter, curling into a tight ball, terror overriding all rational thought. He was home alone. The small, quiet sanctuary was being violated. The shame of being a target, a victim, flooded him. Dead weight. Check the kitchen, a voice barked, rough and unfamiliar. He's gotta be here. Grab anything of value. Carlos squeezed his eyes shut. He was going to be beaten. Maybe worse. He pressed his face into his knees, praying for it to be over fast. Crash. The back door burst inward, slamming against the wall. Then the world outside the counter exploded. It wasn't the sound of men fighting. It was the deep, resonant thud of something heavy connecting with bone. Carlos heard a sharp yelp of pain, followed by a grunt of cold fury. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. "Where is Heinnman?" a new, frantic voice shrieked. Carlos recognized it. "Gary. Where is that bastard?" "He's the one who sent the collectors." "Heinnman isn't here, you idiot," a deep, controlled voice answered, closer than it should have been. "Only me. Ricardo." Carlos gasped, daring to lift his head. Ricardo was framed in the broken doorway, an impossible figure of brutal grace. He was wearing his impeccable suit, completely unharmed, but the air around him crackled with unrestrained violence. Two thugs were already crumpled on the ground, knocked out by quick, efficient strikes. Ricardo was holding a handgun, not pointed but held loosely by his side, its cold, dark metal contrasting sharply with his tailored black sleeve. "Gary Vance," Ricardo said, his voice quiet. He walked toward Gary, who was standing frozen in the middle of the dining room, clutching a crowbar. "You should have stayed in the shadows. Now you have ruined my night. You did this." Gary screamed, his eyes wild with fear and rage. "You sent them. You ruined my life." "Oh." Bang. Carlos screamed, his hands flying to his ears. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. Ricardo didn't flinch. He hadn't shot Gary. He had shot the hand holding the crowbar. The crowbar clattered to the floor, and Gary stared at his own hand in shocked horror, a red stain already spreading. "I didn't come here to kill you," Ricardo said, his voice an icy snarl. He looked like a wolf, cornering a weak animal. "I came here to ask Carlos out for dinner. You ruined the mood." Ricardo tossed the gun to his driver, who had silently materialized in the doorway, and advanced on Gary. He grabbed Gary by the collar of his cheap hoodie, lifting him off his toes. "You called him trash," Ricardo whispered, his breath hot and vicious. "You humiliated him online. You tried to break into the sanctuary I gave him." He slammed Gary against the wall. "If you ever, for any reason, speak his name, look at his house, or cross his path again, I will not send collectors. I will not send my men. I will come for you myself." Ricardo dropped him. Gary collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching his hand. "Take him," Ricardo commanded his driver, gesturing toward the mess of thugs. "Clean this up. And make sure the police find some very incriminating evidence when they arrest Vance for attempted B&E." The driver nodded and began the cleanup operation, moving bodies and securing Gary with brutal efficiency. Carlos, trembling uncontrollably, watched the scene of violence and control. It was terrifying, brutal, and completely mesmerizing. Ricardo was a monster, but he was Carlos's monster. When the room was empty save for the scent of gunpowder and the lingering dampness of fear, Ricardo turned. He saw Carlos huddled behind the counter, a pale, shaking wreck. The ferocity instantly vanished. Carlos. Ricardo's voice was soft, laced with alarm. Carlos tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He slid to the floor, collapsing in a heap of shame and terror. The pressure, the tension, the years of Gary's psychological abuse, it all rushed out of him in one choked sob. Ricardo was beside him in an instant. He didn't question, he didn't command. He simply gathered Carlos up, pulling the shaking man against his chest. Ricardo's heart hammered under his black turtleneck, strong and vital. Carlos buried his face against Ricardo's shoulder, clinging to the expensive fabric, absorbing the heat and the power. "It's over," Ricardo murmured, rocking him gently. "It's over, my angel. He won't touch you again. I promise you." Carlos could smell the faint scent of gunpowder and the sharp, clean smell of Ricardo's cologne. He felt protected, cherished, seen in a way Gary had never allowed. He pulled back slightly, looking up at Ricardo's face. The harsh lines were softened by concern, the storm-gray eyes filled with a desperate intensity. "You were coming for me," Carlos whispered, his voice hoarse. "You were coming to ask me out." "Yes," Ricardo admitted, his hand cupping Carlos's damp cheek, the warmth of his palm a startling contrast to the cold fear still gripping Carlos. "I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see you." "Why?" Carlos asked, the question escaping him on a ragged exhale, the one question he couldn't answer. "Why do you care this much?" Ricardo didn't speak. He answered with action. His eyes dropped to Carlos's lips, and then, with a low, guttural sound that was half relief and half hungry demand, Ricardo closed the distance. The kiss was desperate, breath-stealing, and overwhelming. It wasn't gentle. Ricardo's mouth was urgent, a seeking heat that devoured Carlos's soft resistance. His arm wrapped around Carlos's back, pressing him flush against his hard, powerful chest, eliminating the space that had kept them apart for weeks. Carlos felt a spark ignite inside him, not just lust but a shocking release of fear and pain. He kissed back, pouring all his pent-up gratitude, terror, and desire into the response. He tasted copper and the subtle sting of whiskey on Ricardo's breath. This was the connection he had felt on the transfusion line, made real. This was the moment the debt was paid and the true bond was forged. Ricardo pulled back, his lips wet, his eyes burning with triumph and fierce adoration. He looked utterly consumed. "Because you belong to me," Ricardo stated, his voice raw, his thumb tracing the curve of Carlos's lower lip. "And now I belong to you." He lifted Carlos into his arms as easily as if he weighed nothing, carrying him out of the ruined house and toward the waiting safety of his black SUV. Chapter 7, Choosing Each Other, Choosing a Future. The fragile peace that descended upon the Heinnman mansion felt heavier than any war. Gary Vance was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including attempted burglary and possession of an illegal firearm, planted expertly by Ricardo's meticulous team. The Mancini family's attack was met with a swift, devastating counterstrike to their financial interests, sending a clear, bloody message. Carlos was untouchable. For 2 days the fortress was quiet. Ricardo and Carlos remained wrapped in a bubble of intense, domestic intimacy. They didn't leave the main suite. Carlos felt cherished and utterly seen. Ricardo felt the burden of fear. On the third morning, Ricardo pulled away from Carlos, his face shadowed with a cold, resolute look Carlos hadn't seen since the alley. "I've arranged everything," Ricardo said, his voice flat, devoid of the passion of the past nights. Carlos sat up, the silk sheets sliding down his chest. "Arranged what, Ricardo?" "Your safety," he replied, turning toward the window. The vast city skyline seemed to loom over his shoulder like a judging audience. The Mancini attack was the final warning. "This life is too dangerous for you, amore mio. You are pure, and I am the dirtiest thing in this city." Ricardo turned back, his storm-gray eyes filled with agonizing determination. "I bought you a villa on the coast of Italy. It's fully secured, off the grid. You'll have staff, protection, and complete financial autonomy. You can go back to school, work, live the life you deserve. The life without the constant threat of a bullet or a knife." Carlos stared at him, the joy of the last few days curdling into a crushing pain. "You're sending me away." "I am saving you," Ricardo corrected, the word ripped from his chest. "I cannot risk losing you. You are the only good thing that has ever touched me. If you stay here, you become a permanent target. I can't live with that kind of fear." "And what about you?" Carlos asked, his voice shaking. Do you think living alone on a beach without the man who saved you is a better fate than being shot? Ricardo's jaw clenched. My fate is already sealed. Yours is not. You will leave tonight. He tried to walk past Carlos, but Carlos grabbed his arm. The strength in his desperate grip surprised them both. No, Carlos said, standing up, meeting Ricardo's height with his own fierce conviction. You don't get to decide my fate anymore, Ricardo. Carlos, you don't understand the risks. I understand risk. Carlos interrupted, his voice rising in volume, raw with weeks of suppressed emotion. I stood on the street begging because my fiancé called me dead weight. I shoved my hand into a bleeding wound to save a stranger. I let a man break into my house because I was too ashamed to call for help. I know risk, Ricardo. But I faced all of that alone, and I felt nothing but cold emptiness. Carlos stepped forward, crowding Ricardo, forcing the powerful man to look only at him. You gave me a house, a life and safety, Carlos admitted, his eyes glistening. But none of that mattered until you kissed me behind that counter, covered in the smoke of a gunshot. Until you called me mine. He reached up, cupping Ricardo's unshaven jaw, replicating Ricardo's own intimate gesture from the night before. I left you once, Ricardo, Carlos whispered, his voice catching. I bled into your veins and then I walked out into the rain because I was afraid of the commitment. I'm not leaving you again. Not for a villa, not for peace, and not for safety. He swallowed, gathering the courage for the final, terrifying confession. I don't need to be saved from your life. I need to be saved by you. I love you, Ricardo Heinnman. I love your power, I love your danger, and I love the tenderness you only show me. And if I am a target, then I will stand beside you, armed with whatever protection you choose to give me. Ricardo's perfect composure shattered. His eyes were wide, glistening with unshed emotion. The control he exerted over his empire vanished in that instant. Carlos, he breathed, the name a gasp of relief and pain. You don't know what you're asking for. I am asking for my partner, Carlos asserted, his fingers threading into the dark, thick hair at the nape of Ricardo's neck. Ricardo didn't hesitate. He pulled Carlos into a kiss that was slow, deep, and soul-shaking. It was a kiss of absolute surrender, a covenant made in the morning light. It tasted like finality, acceptance, and a devastating relief. When they finally broke apart, Ricardo rested his forehead against Carlos's. Then you will have it, Ricardo said, his voice rough with emotion. No more houses on the coast. No more hiding. You are my light, Carlos. And I will burn down the world to keep you safe. Ricardo didn't offer Carlos a job. He didn't offer charity. He offered him a choice, the only choice that mattered. Be my partner, Carlos, Ricardo said, his gray eyes burning with intensity. Not my employee, not my ward. My partner. The man who stands beside the boss. We will build this future together, in the shadows and in the light. Carlos smiled, a pure, radiant expression that banished the dark shadows from Ricardo's face. Yes, Carlos agreed. Until the end of the line. Later that afternoon, the black armored SUV pulled away from the gates of the mansion. Carlos wasn't in the passenger seat. He was sitting nestled securely in Ricardo's lap in the back, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. Ricardo's suit jacket was draped over Carlos's shoulders, and Carlos's fingers were tightly intertwined with Ricardo's, resting over the fierce beat of his heart. They weren't heading to a meeting or a negotiation. They were heading to a remote, private airfield for a weekend away, a honeymoon of sorts before the inevitable storm returned. As they drove through the tunnels beneath the city, the cold, distant city lights reflected in their eyes. Carlos looked up at the man who had been a dying stranger, then his terrifying savior, and finally, his devoted love. A once homeless man and the kingpin of the city, driving together into a future where the threat of death was constant, but the promise of love was stronger. Carlos leaned his head back against Ricardo's shoulder, a profound, settled peace washing over him. He was finally home. 5 years passed, measured not in the sterile months of a calendar, but in the heat of whispered meetings and the chilling silence after a rival family was neutralized. Carlos and Ricardo built their life into a unified front. Carlos managed the legitimate side of the Heinnman empire with ruthless efficiency, his morality now a flexible thing bent around protecting his love. He was no longer the fragile victim. He was the consigliere of the heart, a polished, dangerous force, always armed with both a sharp wit and the knowledge of the compound's safe rooms. Their love was a constant, burning force. Ricardo treated Carlos not just as a partner but as his anchor, the one stable point in his violent world. They had the rare kind of happiness that felt both deeply earned and impossibly precarious. They had everything: wealth, power, and each other. The anniversary gift wrapped gift. It was their 5-year anniversary, the official one, marking the day Ricardo had dragged the terrified Carlos out of the alley and into his car. Ricardo had surprised Carlos with a simple, heavy silver key. "It's to the new vault in the Swiss bank," Ricardo murmured, kissing the back of Carlos's neck as they stood on the mansion's balcony, overlooking their territory. "It's the backup for the backup. Everything that matters is there, including the documents that secure your future if I ever fall." Carlos turned in his arms, his heart aching with the casual darkness of the statement. "Don't talk like that," he whispered, pressing his forehead to Ricardo's. "We're building an empire, not a memorial." "We are building a legacy," Ricardo corrected, his eyes softening. "And the legacy needs protection." Carlos smiled, slipping the key into his pocket. It was a tangible weight, a symbol of the trust and power Ricardo had given him. The monumental cliffhanger collision. 3 days later, Ricardo left for a sensitive negotiation in Sicily. It was supposed to be a standard diplomatic mission to expand Heinnman influence, only lasting 48 hours. Carlos tried to immerse himself in work in the mansion's secure office, but he felt an electric unease in the air, the same prickling fear he'd felt before the Mancini attack. At precisely 2 a.m., the secure phone on Ricardo's desk, the one reserved only for critical family calls, lit up. Carlos grabbed it instantly. "Heinnman residence," Carlos answered, his voice steady, professional. The voice on the other end was rough, panicked, and heavily accented. Ricardo's most trusted Sicilian operative. "Sir, you need to hear this, but you must remain calm," the man pleaded, static spitting on the line. There was an ambush on the plane. A complete setup. Senator Valenti was behind it. He double-crossed the boss. Carlos gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Is Ricardo safe? Where is he?" The operative took a ragged, shuddering breath. "The last transmission we received was from the burning wreckage of the jet. We have confirmed casualties, sir. We found Mr. Heinnman's blood, a significant amount, type O negative, everywhere." A cold, absolute silence fell over Carlos. He barely registered the operative's continuing panicked words. "Blood. O negative. We have accounted for every body, Mr. Carlos," the man whispered, the static growing louder. "We know he was wounded, possibly fatally. But sir, Ricardo Heinnman's body is not among the wreckage. He is gone." Carlos stared out at the dark, silent city, his own blood running cold. Ricardo wasn't dead, not confirmed. But he was severely injured, exposed, and missing in hostile territory. The Mafia Kingpin, the man who owed Carlos his life, had vanished. Carlos's hand flew to his pocket, gripping the heavy, cold silver key. He was sitting on top of an empire that was now completely exposed, and the love of his life was bleeding out somewhere in Sicily, unable to be found. He stood up, his expression hardening into a terrifying mask of resolve. He reached for the secure comms panel on Ricardo's desk, ignoring the frantic demands of the Sicilian operative still on the phone. The time for accounting was over. The time for being the partner was here. "Execute protocol red," Carlos ordered the head of the mansion's defense team, his voice like ice. "Lock down all assets. Prepare the retrieval team. I'm going to Sicily. And tell Senator Valenti to prepare his funeral, because he just made a debt with the wrong man."
Thanks for sticking to the end. This is the end and there won't be other parts, just so you know. I hope you enjoyed it so far. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you in the next one. Stay in the love.